post this on YouTube after. So if people missed it, or if they want to share it after, we can do that as well. Thank you everybody for being here. This is so cool and so awesome. I'm so excited about this, that we have so many people that are coming into the rooms. As a quick logistics, if you've not done Zoom webinar before, obviously our panelists who are here have their video on. You will unfortunately be just as an attendee. You will be able to ask us questions, which we would love for you to do. So first of all, as we're asking people to come in, introduce yourself on the chat, because I feel like it's so cool and what an awesome opportunity to have so many people from the region in one chat room right now. But then also, there's a Q&A button on the bottom of our of the screen. Feel free to ask questions. I know that we have a lot of amazing people from our own ecosystems, would love to hear from you as well. So send us messages so we can give you a shout out. I know people from my own ecosystem, including my partner, my team, that are all in the webinar right now. So would love to be able to highlight all the amazing people that are doing this, because I think while we're getting into this, the reason why all four of us decided to come together to do this is because it's such a great opportunity, I think, in this space. And I'm one of those really annoyingly optimistic and positive people when everybody else is very stressed. And I am stressed too. And I really hope everyone here is staying safe and healthy and socially distanced. But I also find this time to be really exciting, because it's such an opportunity for us to have conversations that we may not typically be having. And I think Pakistan tends to be the main culprit for why this isn't the case. So I have to name that. We cannot get visas to go to Bangladesh. Bangladeshis can't come to Pakistan. It's really expensive to fly to Nepal. It's a little bit tricky sometimes, though a lot of Pakistanis do go to Sri Lanka. But sometimes maybe a lot of people don't come to Pakistan. Obviously, we have an issue with the Sri Lankan cricket team from way before when they came to Pakistan. So there's a lot of really interesting political and security barriers for why, even despite the fact that we are supposed to be regionally cooperating as in South Asia, why we don't always do that. And for me personally, I'm going to let everybody introduce themselves, but for me personally, I'm half Bangladeshi. My mom is Bangladeshi. My dad's Pakistani. I have grown up in both places. So I have had so many amazing opportunities, and we'll talk about our work as well, where I've been able to do a lot of amazing collaborations in the region and just see how much is similar about all of us rather than what's different. And I find it such a shame to not be able to speak to each other more. So this is what today is for. What I would love to do is to basically ask each of our panelists, and I'm just going to kind of list the order if that works for you guys, just to make it a little bit easier facilitation. I am the moderator / also part of the discussion today, but I'm lucky that I have gotten to know these guys a little bit. So we'll be asking a lot of questions. So what I would love to do, and feel free again to ask questions in the Q&A, we will get to it in the last half hour. But what I would love to do is to ask each of the panelists to say who they are, where they're coming from, and then also why they do what they do. So what's your organization and what brought you to this work, right? Because for all of us are ecosystem enablers in some way. And why I thought it was important to name that there's so many people from our ecosystems that are in this chat. It is not just one of us that will build our ecosystem, right? There's so many players that are involved in what we do, but it's sometimes like takes the why of why we do what we do is so important. So I'd love for each of you guys to describe that. So maybe we can go Enosh first. Actually, maybe because you guys are both Sri Lanka, let's do Ejaj first, Enosh, and then Sajani, if that works. And then I'll also introduce myself too. So Ejaj, go ahead.
Great. Thank you, Kulsum. Thank you for organizing this. I think it's a wonderful opportunity to convene with friends from Sri Lanka and Pakistan, to have a conversation around startups, challenges, opportunities. I run the Bangladesh Youth Leadership Center. My plan A in life was to become a leader. It did not work out. So I thought I might as well start teaching leadership to others. So I got into this work 12 years ago. And one of my realizations early on in my life was I previously worked as an economist. And when I was working as an economist in Bangladesh between 2003 and 2006, one of my realizations was that Bangladesh is poor, not because of money, but because of leadership. And if you can change the quality of leadership across multiple sectors, then you can change the country. So I went to graduate school in the US. I came back in 2008 and I started BYLC. So the main problem we're trying to solve is teach people 21st century skills, leadership skills, instill in them values, empathy, tolerance, inclusiveness, some of the things that the world needs today. So that's how I started. After doing this work for 5 years, what I realized is many of my alumni, because we started with a social mission, right? I wanted to change the country. And you have to be naive and foolish at a young age to take on the kind of work that I did. But what I realized is many of our alumni were coming to the job market and struggling to find jobs. And then I thought, if young people don't have jobs, how can they help others? Because to support others, you need to ensure your own livelihood, right? So I got into a job placement. We started a project training young people, placing them in the private sector. We did that for a few years. And while doing that, I realized there are not enough jobs in Bangladesh. The number of young people who are coming to the job market every year versus the jobs that are created, there's a huge mismatch. And then I got into investing because I thought if there are not enough jobs, then you have to create jobs. So let's start investing in young people. So my first round of investment, I invested $100,000. I gave 10 groups of young people, go change the world. All of them failed. One was successful. My entrepreneur then took migration, went to Germany. So all 10 of them, but I did not lose heart. So then what I realized is it's not enough to just give young people money. You have to monitor them closely. So now we have a co-working space, we have an accelerator. I give the money, but I have a lot of control on what we do. So we do leadership education, we connect young people to jobs, and we help entrepreneurs grow their businesses. So that's sort of, in a nutshell, what I'm trying to do. Thank you.
Yeah. And before Enosh speaks, as a quick aside, because there's a lot of BYLC graduates that are in this chat, everyone you meet in Dhaka that is doing work anywhere that I've ever met in working with startups has been a BYLC grad, and shout out to all those people, because I think the type of change you've created in that ecosystem is so cool. So go ahead, Enosh.
Yeah. So I think like what amazing things this coronavirus is doing, right? I mean, four different people, like completely diverse. I don't think we would have ever thought of meeting like this ever, but it's made possible right now, and woohoo for that. And also, I think I think I'm clearly not under pressure. It's like 76 people already, probably the only conference with the highest number of people that I've been. So I'm Enosh from Colombo, Sri Lanka, and I started a digital content creation, digital journalism company about 10 years back. This is a period where probably the word startup wasn't even known. It wasn't a buzzword. So we purely dived into this with pure passion. And the gap that we saw was, the local media, especially TV and the newspapers. We saw that, when the tech industry was booming and when there was new tech companies, new startups, they were trying to do some new innovations, the new stuff that was happening, but the media was not picking it up. Even if, let's say, a company has a launch or something, what usually happens in the media, let's say a newspaper journalist would go there and they would write about who was the chief guest and who lit the oil lamp. So it's a traditional thing that, chief guests light an oil lamp here. So they just write about who lit the oil lamp and what was their serve for breakfast. Nothing about the technology, nothing about the innovation, nothing about the founder or the entrepreneur. And that kind of it kind of aggravated that there is some need in the market that we need to take these stories out. We need to unearth stories. We need to seek out, all of these new initiatives that are happening. We need to bring these people out. And one of the things that we wanted to do was we wanted to take this story out to the world. And that's when we started a media platform called ReadMe. And we've been doing stories about founders, startups, the entire ecosystem for the past 10 years. So pretty much right now, what we do is we create connections. We run some amazing programs. Just to name a few, there is one called F Up Fridays. So this is culturally, I think mostly Asian countries, we usually don't come out with a failure. I mean, failure is like frowned upon. So we wanted to sort of let founders and entrepreneurs to embrace failures, because that's part of the journey. And only if you fail that you can go forward. So we have come up with events like F-Up Fridays, where we bring established entrepreneurs who ask them to come forward and share their failure stories. We have another meetup called the Spike Colombo, where we bring industry veterans and ask them to talk about their subject areas, how they were able to set up companies and what they're doing, how they have been doing for so long. And a few initiatives like that. So recently, I think we collaborated with Colombo Cooperative as well. And I think it's been an amazing journey since then. I think last 3 weeks, we've been having like back-to-back of webinars. And we're seeing a lot of positive energy actually after Corona happened. So that's a little bit about what I do and from my.
Awesome. Go ahead.
So I'm Sajani. I am also from Sri Lanka. Originally, I now live in San Francisco, which is why it's 6:30 a.m. here. But it's honestly an awesome initiative. Thanks, Kalsum, because Kalsum and I both basically remotely run our ventures and from the US. So when all of this was happening, we connected and we're like, oh, this is finally like, work from home. This is what we do and across time zones. So, but I'm just glad that this, we're making something productive out of this, whatever that is happening, and bringing and able to come together and have a productive conversation. So I started Colombo Cooperative. It is a co-working space in Sri Lanka. And the way how I got to that was I had come to the US as an immigrant for university, and then I got into some really amazing companies to work at Amazon and at Microsoft. And I just realized that what in the US at least, you don't have to really like know anyone, but you also do, because networking is how you kind of get things done, and you have to build those networks. But you don't have to come from a certain place or be, know from that. You can get to know those ecosystems and those networks. And I just saw that we weren't really doing that as enough in Sri Lanka. In Sri Lanka, this one's that one and that one's this one. And that's kind of how everyone's everyone, at least a few years ago. I think things have become completely different and are improving now. And so I had gone to a lot of networking events in order to get the opportunities I wanted, or get to know other people who are doing really cool things that are not in corporate. And a lot of these networking events happen at co-working spaces. And I was like, we should do this in Sri Lanka. And at that time, we really had maybe 2 spaces. And there was, at least from my research, wasn't much community happening. And what I wanted to do was create a space that we made that a focus and collaborated and kind of brought those values, whatever I could learn from here to there, and actually, grow the community over there. So now we have an amazing set of members, and we've been in operation for about 1.5 years. And we've had the opportunity to do awesome things, like with Enosh, we've done events with a lot of the other ecosystem players in Sri Lanka. In the startup world, we've done events, and we have monthly networking events that happen. And actually, I think we upped our events game when this coronavirus is happening, and we've been able to, it kind of gave an opportunity to oh, everyone's at home, let's bring more people to the table. And that's, it's one silver lining at least that has come out of all of this.
Cool. Yeah, I think my team, shout out to Armin on the call. She helped coordinate all of this today. But they were kind of like, oh my gosh, every time I come up with a new event idea, I've been just coming up with event ideas of let's do more. And she was like, everyone's like, oh my gosh, please calm down. Yeah. So I'll introduce myself as well. My name is Kulsum Lakhani. I'm the founder and CEO of Invest to Innovate. I'm also a partner in I2I Ventures, which is our early stage venture capital fund for Pakistan. It's also Pakistan's first female founded institutional fund, which is cool. And hopefully eventually that will no longer be in the future. Maybe that will no longer be something that we like pump our fists about. It's just going to be the normal, but for now it's not. So I founded I2I 8 years ago, right when the Pakistani startup ecosystem was extremely new. There was obviously players that were operating in the market, but mostly like competitions and some events and awards, but not really like things that were happening on a structural basis. And so for me, the why behind I2I, and for those Pakistanis that are there, there's a very famous, now infamous Tahir Shah song called I2I. So that's not why we called our company I2I. And I will send it, for our panelists who haven't seen it, I will send you the video after this. I started it because I was working in venture philanthropy before I launched I2I. And I just saw and it continues to be the case, right? I was just on some pretty frustrating calls with funders this week, where everyone just looks at the same markets over and over again, and everyone believes that they're just going to support entrepreneurs in East Africa. That's not a bad thing because they're obviously amazing, but they're only all looking in a very herd mentality type of way, that there's only potential internationally that exists in Silicon Valley, or in, if they're looking internationally, East Africa, India. And for me, what I was getting frustrated by as someone who is, as I mentioned earlier in the call, I'm Pakistani, but my mom is Bangladeshi. So I've kind of grown up everywhere. I'm what we call a TCK, or a third culture kid. I sound completely American, but didn't move to the US until I was 18. And so lived in Dhaka, Dubai, Pakistan, all of the places. So for me, I was like, well, there's potential that exists everywhere. And especially in countries like all of ours being represented on the call, there's so many young people. And when you have so many problems that surround you, obviously there's going to be people that are automatically entrepreneurial, right? They're going to build solutions to address the challenges that they see in front of them. And so I2I was really started to support that, because we believe that the next great innovators are coming from the most challenging places, but because they exist in those challenging places, they need support to turn that potential into a reality. And so when I started I2I, I really thought it was just going to be, it was going to be everywhere. And then you start in a country like Pakistan and you're like, oh my gosh, there's so much to do just in this one ecosystem, right? Which I don't even know if we'd qualify Pakistan as an ecosystem back in 2011 when I started. But now, and this is going to lead into my next question, there's so much that's happening in the ecosystem, right? And it's the result of so many players. It's not just, while it's so amazing, the four of us that are on this call, we are just one of the many levers that exists in the ecosystems that we're part of. So for me, my why is because I really believe in that potential, and I really thrive on, for me, what I always say is my personal why statement is I believe that the greatest injustice is potential that is unleashed. Like, I just think that's the worst thing ever. And it sounds like similar to all four of us, we actually all echo each other in that, which I think is what brought us all together for this call. So on that note, so many of us that are here, we have 83 people, which is amazing, on this call from all of our different countries. We may not know what I want to state that all of us know what an ecosystem is. It is a very big and overly used buzzword, right? Ecosystem, people just drop that in sentences, but what does that mean? And what I think is really important is for all of us maybe to take a couple minutes to actually talk about the state of our own startup ecosystems, right? Where does our startup ecosystem lie right now in terms of how long has it been developing for? Are there a lot of players? Like in Bangladesh, I know it's very concentrated in Dhaka. So let's take a couple minutes to maybe just explain the state of our own startup ecosystems. And then what I would love for each of you guys to do is maybe state one or two of the biggest challenges that you feel startups face in your own markets. So maybe let's start with the Sri Lanka folks first. So Sajani and Enosh, and then maybe we'll talk about Bangladesh, and then I'll talk about Pakistan. So go ahead, guys.
Enosh, you can start.
Yeah, sure. So I think the Sri Lankan startup ecosystem, you can probably date it back to maybe at most a decade, maybe. So I think real activity started probably maybe around 2008, 2009, and that was like the early startups. And then I think towards 2010 is where we probably got a batch of entrepreneurs, founders coming forward, and I'm also one of them. So we have a good set of, I think about 10 to 20 friends, like we are very close. We have seen how the ecosystem has grown over the years. I think if you actually like probably go back in time, maybe most of the activity in terms of events, investments, connections, probably all of that would have started maybe about at most 3 to 5 years gap. So maybe from 2015 onwards. And maybe I think the last 2 to 3 years have been very, very active in terms of events, networking, and more of being open. Like I think a few years back, people were very hesitant to even share ideas because I think the common knowledge was, okay, if I share some idea, somebody would like, steal it and run away. So right now, I think all of that is slowly fading away. People are more open. People share ideas. There is more openness, transparency happening right now. And I think maybe 2020 is like amazing. I think at the start of this decade, 2020 going to 2030, like just looked amazing. And then Corona happened. We are yet to see how it turns out, but I think we as a country have been completely resilient for so many things that has happened in our country. So we came out of a 30-year war, which I think was restricting so many things in terms of startups, infrastructure, entrepreneurship, the entire ecosystem as a whole. And I think once we came out of that, the environment was much more conducive to bring out more founders and initiatives, startup initiatives. But then I think
that is that time that 2009 was when the war ended. And like you were saying, like that was that time, I think in 2010. And I was, when each year that I would come back to Sri Lanka, it would be a complete different like place. It's not the place we grew up in.
Exactly. And so I think after that, I think probably, as one would have expected, things would have just, started accelerating at a pace soon after that. But what kept on happening was we had the floods happening in 2016, actually in 2015. That was, I think, bad management of the city planning. But that again happened in 2016. And, it just completely halted all of the operations in Colombo. So quickly giving a overview of what the city is and the country is, most of the startups and entrepreneurship, all of these initiatives is heavily concentrated in Colombo. That's the city, heavily concentrated. So right now, I would all what I'm talking is mostly related to Colombo because outside of Colombo, it's almost dead. Like there's nothing happening outside, but over the last few years, there's been some good initiatives coming up. Especially, I would like to mention Jaffna. Jaffna has been like simply amazing. I mean, their determination is like, I don't know, like, you cannot match anywhere else in the world. It's like so crazy.
What do they do?
And they've been. So Jaffna is pretty much which was the northern part of Sri Lanka.
Northern part. That's
oh, sorry. I was like confused for a second. Okay, yeah.
So I think during the war, I think probably the northern part of Sri Lanka was completely affected, and there was no development for almost 3 decades there. But when you look at how the cultures and how the personalities evolve, is like the people in the north have so much of resilience.
Yeah,
it's just it's like so much of resilience. I mean, we back in the city, we take so many things for granted. Which ones, soon after the war, when we went back to the north, when we got to see all of these things, we were thinking, hey, this is great. It was like, time stopped almost 30 years ago because you went back. It was almost time traveling when you when we passed and when I went in a bus. It was like almost time traveling going back into the north. And to see, over the years, how they've been developing, it's just amazing.
That's cool.
Yeah.
Another just a thing to add to the ecosystem part, I think even from the funding side, I think so much is happening now in the last 2 to 3 years from what I've seen so far. And I know like Lankan Angel Network, and there's a couple of funds that have been doing some really amazing things. Also, I agree with that whole openness one. Like I remember when I was first starting the co-working space, just in 2018, you don't think it's so far away. I had to explain what a co-working space was to everyone, and but the ecosystem has grown so much that you don't have to do that anymore. Like just as a very simple example, when we were do like Google Ads or Google SEO, right? We were spending money on co-working in Colombo, but we just realized no one is searching for it. No one was searching for co-working in Colombo. Like to see just that term, how much it has grown.
Yeah.
Over the one, like that's just one simple thing. And it's honestly been amazing because I can see like there's all these amazing startups coming up that, and even during this, I know we're going to get to this later, but where a lot of people have adapted, and we are seeing how the government is actually also partnering with all of these startups. So it's been really good. Sorry, Enosh, I think you were going to add something else also.
Yeah, so maybe adding on to what Sajani also said, I think right now we have the openness, I mean, comparatively, I wouldn't say it's like, at the optimal, but it's comparatively better than, previous years. But still, I would say one of the hardest things to break into, or what the younger generation who are yet to get into entrepreneurship or who look at the ecosystem, one of the things is, culturally, we look at the big three careers that we get into. That's the doctor, engineer, lawyer. That has been big in the country. I think that's more, we are more sort of, it's more modernized in the city, but when you take the entire country as a whole, you need to get into one of these jobs. If not, you didn't make it. You need to get into one of these jobs, maybe own a Benz car, and then you're done. You're set for life. So I think more in the city, it's kind of changing. But then again, I think people who choose entrepreneurship or go into a startup is on a very early on age. They decide that. It's very, very rare that somebody who's in the middle of their career suddenly decides, okay, this is not working for me, or I have a new idea, let me get into a startup. That usually doesn't happen. It's very rare. So right now, how it happens is somebody who's like really crazy, who's really eccentric, or who have the real passion, who want to get into it. Those are the ones who get into the startup ecosystem we have right now.
Cool. Thanks, guys. No, there's so many similarities. So I'm excited to dig into this.
And just one thing about females in the startup ecosystem, that also isn't, there is some amazing females right now, but obviously, just like in the US or anywhere else in the world, there just isn't enough. And I think there is so much just problems that men don't think about, that aren't going to be addressed. And I think like even I was the female to start a co-working space there, right? And it's just like, so you can see that when people were first walking into Colombo Co-op, they were like, oh my God, there's so many plants. And they're like, and I think there is a different way that you think of inclusivity.
Yeah. I'm sure too. Do you have a lot of female members as well, maybe even in comparison to other co-working spaces?
No, we unfortunately, it's not like, I would love to see more. I would love to see more than 50%, but we don't. And it's a mix of what is the market out there, right? Also, there's not as many women starting. In Colombo Co-op, we did a small residency for 2 entrepreneurs, like female entrepreneurs, that to help with their side projects. So I think there's just like more and more that needs to happen over the years in order for us to really cultivate that. And also we only 3% of VC funding, I think it increased, right, from 2.5% all these years to 3% last year of VC funding in the US that went to women. I think I don't even want to know the fraction of the number in South Asia.
Yeah, I have that data for Pakistan, so I can share that. It's not great, but it's actually not bad comparatively. So
That's good. So
yeah.
I think it's something that we just need to work on.
Yeah. Ejaj, I'm trying to be mindful of time because I want us to get through as many things as possible. So maybe if you want to take just a few minutes to talk about Bangladesh, I'll talk about Pakistan, and then let's dive into some of the bigger questions. Oh, you're on mute, by the way.
I think the Bangladesh trajectory is similar to the Sri Lankan trajectory in some ways. I think about 12 years ago, 10, 12 years ago, we started with a lot of competitions. And then over the years, we got a lot more organized. First came some co-working spaces, but now there's an organized angels network. Many startups in Bangladesh have received funding from institutional investors in Bangladesh. There are, funding vehicles inside Bangladesh. Many startups from Bangladesh are receiving funding from Singapore and elsewhere. So that has been a good progress. Bikash is by far the most, successful startup from Bangladesh in fintech. They've been, very good at raising money from Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, IFC, and recently, in recent years, from Ant Financial. So they've done very well. And then we have these large ride-sharing companies. So the ecosystem has evolved quite a bit. I would not say it's matured, but it's a lot more organized. There is a lot more that needs to be done. And then came 2020, the coronavirus, which I think is going to set us back again by a few years. But that's for us to cover later on. But I think we are a lot more organized now than we were, say, 5 years ago.
And I would say the same about Bangladesh. Actually, I was just on a call with another investor in Pakistan, and we were just talking about Bangladesh has actually accelerated their ecosystem in just 5 years. So what I'll say about Pakistan, and then I'll just compare it a little bit. So I actually realized, because I'm so in moderator mode, that I didn't really, beyond saying that we have a fund and Eye to Eye which supports entrepreneurs, I didn't explain what we do. We have 3 arms that invest to innovate. Well, not 3 arms. We have a separate entity, which is our fund, and now obviously invest in startups. We started the country's first startup accelerator back in 2012, and that flagship program has been running for 8 years, but now we license that content and curriculum to support programs in other geographies as well as in Pakistan. Actually, BYLC is one of our partners in Bangladesh. We work with LC Impact, we've worked with SD Asia, Toru, worked with a lot of amazing partners out there. And then we have a research arm, which is what I'm going to talk about a little bit right now, because that actually speaks to the ecosystem. So we realized that there was such a lack of understanding of what happens in these markets, right? So even listening about Sri Lanka, I was like, man, I wish there's so much happening, and I kind of know qualitatively because I've spoken to a few people, but there needs to be like research that's done. And just a quick shout out to LC Impact in Bangladesh. They're doing a lot of amazing data collection. We're actually going to be doing a joint webinar with them in 2 weeks on data that we're collecting during COVID about startups in both of our ecosystems. So stay tuned to that. But I really have to give a shout out to them because they're doing such incredible work for Bangladesh. For us, the Pakistan ecosystem, I mean, it's been happening before 8 years, but really I would say that, 8 years ago when we started, the ecosystem was very new. There was competitions, things that are happening. So 8 years later, we went, and our data actually shows us, and I'll put a link to our ecosystem report that we released in November with the World Bank. And that actually shows, we actually show in 8 years what happened, which was there was only 2, there was an incubator and an accelerator, major, and no significant funding sources. And now there is 25 incubators and accelerators, many funds and funding sources that exist. And so there's been a huge acceleration, especially in the last 2 years. So I think in the data that we collected in 8 years, the Pakistani ecosystem startups have raised about $180 million in capital. But there was about 105 deals altogether, but 50, a little over 55 of those deals have happened just in the last 2 years. So I think what that to me signifies is that there's just been such an accelerated growth of an ecosystem. And because Pakistan, so it's really interesting to hear about Sri Lanka, how things that are different about the north and how that's developing, but everything still is kind of concentrated in Colombo. I would say the same in Bangladesh. A lot of it's, there are things that are happening
in Dhaka,
in Chittagong, but mostly it's happening in Dhaka. In Pakistan, what we started seeing was is that, the ecosystem, really the start of the ecosystem, starting in Lahore, Karachi has always been our commercial capital, but now we have pretty significant ecosystems in Lahore, Karachi, and Islamabad. Also things that are happening in Peshawar. And the Pakistan government, so similar to what Sajani, you were mentioning about the Sri Lankan government, the Pakistani government has gotten pretty involved. I know Bangladesh, it's the same as well. The Pakistani government has gotten pretty involved in terms of supporting these public-private partnerships in the form of these national incubation centers that have launched in the last 3 or 4 years. They've launched in every major city in the country. And so as an investor, what's interesting is that we've overall seen a growth in the volume of deals. So we've seen a lot of volume of companies, I would say. Not necessarily the quality, though I think overall quality, when I look at pipeline for our accelerator, has definitely improved over the last 8 years. And I think that's really cool. I'm definitely seeing overall trends of companies that are coming up in certain sectors, which I want to talk to you guys about too, is like, what are we seeing? But I would still say, and I would maybe point to this as the case for Bangladesh, which I know a little bit better, but I would be curious about Sri Lanka as well. I would say that Pakistan, our main barrier to the growth of the ecosystem is really the regulatory environment, right? So the flow of money in and out of Pakistan is extremely difficult. I say this as a fund that is now set up, we're domiciled outside of Pakistan because we have to be. Getting money in and out is really hard. Ejaj was talking about Bcash. Our fintech space is growing. We have EasyPasa and a few players, but it needs to be moving a lot faster, especially when we think about payments being a massive issue for companies. Taxation is a major issue for startups. Even right now, and we're going to be talking about the COVID response, the government's federal stimulus plan for business in Pakistan is not even addressing startups, right? It's about industry and it's about exports, which is great, but startups tend to be left out of the conversation a lot of the time, especially when it comes to the regulatory environment. So that, if I was to snapshot nutshell Pakistan, I think that there's so many things that work against Pakistan, unfortunately. If anyone reads headlines about Pakistan, we come across as one of the scariest places on earth, unless you're following Condé Nast's top 20 places to go in the world this year. Pakistan is now #1, but before that, we definitely have a major perception problem, which sounds like it's the same case for Sri Lanka and the same case for Bangladesh in a lot of ways, right? Because there's been so many things that have happened to our countries. And I think to your point, Enosh, which I thought was so great, is that it actually means that our people are so resilient, right? And that to me is what's really exciting about countries like ours, because I feel like the type of entrepreneurs that we produce are people that are really adaptive, because we're so used to being adaptive in our regular life, right? Like there's no electricity or there's something happening here. So you create a solution to that. And we do it without even thinking, right? Like I think when I'm in Pakistan, my normal shifts in terms of how I think about things, like I automatically, if there's, there was a bombing that happened ages ago, there was an attack that happened that made an event that we were about to be canceled. So we came up with an automatic solution in 20 minutes, right? We reconfigured everything. And it just changes. I think for me, that type of resiliency is why I think there's so much potential in our ecosystems. But what I would love to hear from you guys is, and maybe we can talk about this, because I think that there is also such a sameness, as I was mentioning, of who we are as people. We're all Desis ultimately, like we're all from the same subcontinent region. But I always love when I meet people from other frontier markets, because I constantly am realizing that, I was a part of a partnership that worked with incubators across Asia Pacific. And I remember meeting these gentlemen from Fiji, and we had such a cool conversation about building an angel network in Fiji and the same issues that we were facing in Pakistan. And I was like, who knew that Fiji and Pakistan could have something to talk about, right? And so I think it's the same, and especially it's probably even more the case in the subcontinent. But what I'm curious about in our ecosystems are what kinds of companies are successful right now, and what are we seeing in terms of trends, and what's an example of a cool success story from our markets. So maybe let's start with Ejaj. Let's go to you guys, and not to clump Sri Lanka together. So please have your own different perspectives, Sajani and Enosh, and then, and I'll talk about Pakistan.
Thank you. Success is hard to define, because sometimes, you would say a company which is making billions of dollars in loss is successful. Sometimes it can be a smaller company, but it's cash positive, it's making profit. I think that's a better way of looking at success. If you look at success from a fundraising perspective, I think several startups in Bangladesh have done very well. Patha or Shohoj, they've done, they've excelled at raising funding, although some of them are finding.
For those who may not know, can you explain what Patha and Shohoj does?
So both Patha and Shohoj are ride-sharing companies, but now they've pivoted into a technology company that does logistics, delivery, ticketing, a lot of different things. There's a lot of verticals, but primarily ride-sharing companies. They've done quite well in terms of raising good funding. bKash, as I said before, is a very solid company. The reason I talk about bKash is because I like the entrepreneur. It's very cool and nice to be young and start your own startup, right? When you're 25, 22. But I think there's a lot of value in having solid management experience before you launch your startup, and the success rate there is greater. And the founder of bKash has had a startup before, solid management experience. So I have a lot of respect for the entrepreneur who started bKash. And I think when I look at Sajani, I think she's got a great chance. First of all, co-working space is going to do very well right now in this space. People don't want to, why spend so much money on offices? And the other is, with your background in Microsoft, I think that management experience is definitely useful. And that's one advice I always give to young people, that if you can have some solid management experience before starting your own startup, that counts. That matters a lot. So, yeah.
Our guys in Sri Lanka?
So, I'm sorry, tell me the question again.
So the question is really like, what are examples, like, are there sectors that we're seeing that are coming up in your ecosystem in terms of startups that are really rising in certain sectors over others? And then what's an example of a successful or a success story from your market?
So I think right now there is a lot of interest in fintech, but just to give a very recent example, about 3 weeks back, one of our largest supermarket chains was doing about 100 orders per day on their e-commerce platform. That was running, so that wasn't even making enough money to keep the service running for that website. But that was running mainly for the expats to buy groceries for their parents in Sri Lanka. Now, 3 weeks later, they're doing close to about 5,000 orders per day. And to look at market is only catering to 15% of the entire market, because all the other, basically 85% is through the small mom and pop shops. But right now, after an event like COVID-19, what's happening is when the entire country is on lockdown, there is a huge amount of pressure and burden on the e-commerce platform's shoulders that they have to now meet the entire country's demand. And that too, it was like, they were so under pressure because they had to figure out what to do within like a couple of days. So that was, it was scary at one, it's also scary, but it's also to see like, there is so much of opportunities and potentials that a pandemic like this is creating. So that was interesting to see. But when we look at in terms of our ecosystem, I think ride-hailing app has done pretty good here. So we have an alternative to the local version of Uber. It's called Pick Me. So probably one of the best examples of a successful startup in Sri Lanka. I think to name a few other companies would be a company called Basha, a company called Arimac, Takas, a few other companies.
And what do they all do? Just as like to get an understanding of sectors.
So Takas is an e-commerce platform. Basha is into app creation. Basha is into quite a few things. So they are into payment gateway. They have a language translation app. Arimac is into game development and few other development as well, softwares. So these guys have been there for
as well, right? You know, like ODoc is doing well right now as well. So there's like some healthcare apps coming in as well. I know that, you know, she was saying fintech is becoming a thing, but I think they're also going to have that same regulatory problem as well.
It's the same in Pakistan.
Yeah, so but it's awesome. Like I think there's a lot happening in that space as well. And I mean, but the talent is just amazing. I saw a demo of a team that came to demo in an AR app. And I had seen a demo just here because, you know, in San Francisco, you go to a coffee shop and someone is doing something.
Pitching to a VC.
Yeah, exactly. So because I was just sitting next to someone and I was eavesdropping on it, and I was like, oh my God, you're trying to, you know, solve a really cool problem. And then he gave me a demo, and I thought the Sri Lankan startups demo was better than the one that they were developing here. And you know, that just goes to say how the amount of talent that we have in our region, honestly.
Yeah, and I think yeah, go ahead, Enosh.
No, I mean, since you mentioned about the government as well, I think probably the last sector to adopt technology we would have, I mean, government would have been the last thing that we would have thought. But you know, the pandemic happens, and you know, within under a week, there was one public sector which completely went working from home, 100%. Yeah. And that was like amazing. We never even saw this happening for the next 50 years. So that was something amazing. I mean, there were some really good people behind it who drove this initiation, and I think good things like that is also happening. And maybe just to name one more thing would be, see, there was a lot of spotlight onto e-commerce platforms soon after this happened, because there was a lot of social media buzz, late deliveries, and you know, price issues, all of this. And what happened was there was one particular incident where one e-commerce platform, there was a bit of concerns in terms of pricing and delivery, and all of that sort of a saga going on. And what happened was, suddenly the attention of the authorities shifted to these guys, and they actually took action within about 2 or 3 days. And that was quite amazing to see, because on a usual day, this would have just gone like, you know, we would have just, you know, given a blind eye to this. Nobody would have, you know, given so much of importance to this. But right now, because there's so much of spotlight, there was action taken, and probably it also sent out a strong message for the other e-commerce platforms of what they need to be doing. Right now, in terms of, you know, guidelines or regulation, it's not too strong here. It's a bit of gray area. And within about a week, when we started listing out the number of services, e-commerce platforms, it was just, you know, popping up, like, you know, 50 or 100 per day was popping up. So I think about 1 week later, when we actually listed out, a day earlier, we listed about 20 services which were doing grocery delivery, e-commerce platforms. And then a day later, it was about 200. And it was just crazy. So,
yeah. No, I don't think that's dissimilar from what's happening or what's been happening in Pakistan, obviously. So for me, like, e-commerce is such a huge, it's a sector that has so many verticals within it, right? So obviously, and it's the same in Bangladesh as well. It's like you're seeing a lot of people, at least in the beginning of the ecosystem, you saw a lot of e-commerce platforms. And I think as an investor or even as an accelerator, I was like, if I see another freaking e-commerce platform, I'm going to scream. But at the same time, what starts to happen is that people realizing, because it's the easy thing to do is to launch the platform, right? The harder thing to do is logistics, fulfillment, how to do like the fintech is like addressing issues around payments around e-commerce, right? Especially because at least what we've seen in India is that people have been able to build, like Flipkart was able to do what they did, building it out on cash on delivery, right? And so thinking about consumer behavior has to shift to being online. And so in Pakistan, definitely really similar sectors. I think you're seeing a lot of people in ride hailing. Obviously Kareem, which Kareem is obviously based out of the Middle East and has been acquired by Uber. One of the co-founders is Pakistani. So Pakistanis love to claim it's our story, but it's not, even though Mudassar Sheikha is a hero in Pakistan. But Kareem actually did it outperformed Uber in Pakistan, which I thought was really cool because I think it was seen as such a Pakistan story and because it was so good at localizing what they did. We've definitely seen, obviously, for me, what's the most exciting are people on the fulfillment side, on the logistics side. From an investment perspective, those are hard models to invest in if you don't have deep pockets, because it's obviously very high burn rates. We've invested in and supported a lot of marketplace companies in Pakistan through our accelerator as well as through our fund. And that to me is really interesting because marketplace companies are ultimately an on-demand for something, right? So in these growing consumer bases that we have, Sheba in Bangladesh is similar because they have all these verticals for on-demand for laundry, on-demand for beauticians, on-demand for help, for household help. And it's the same in Pakistan. We actually have just, Sheba is doing it as one company. I've seen, and I've worked with startups in all of those verticals. And I think what's interesting to me, and I've seen this in other emerging markets, is marketplace companies are definitely coming up and they all face the same problem, which is the supply side issue, right? Of how do we fix supply as these companies scale? A big success story, I would say, is a success story in the market is Bikea, which is like our Gojek for Pakistan. It's on motorbikes and ride hailing, doing really well. Manib Meyer, shout out to him, we both went to the same university as well, but he's was also a founder before and a more mature founder. And I think that's what we're also seeing in the market is some of the success stories, quote unquote, are all being kind of launched and built by more mature and more sophisticated founders, which is not a bad thing if you're a young founder, because we're getting a couple questions around this of how to start businesses. And I've obviously worked with people that have been 22 or 23. It's just that I think it's really a cool trend that we're seeing in Pakistan recently of guys that have been working in Silicon Valley, came back to Pakistan, working around the world, or have already been building companies in Pakistan or worked in the corporate space and are now launching companies. And from an investment perspective, we have 2 companies that are active in our portfolio, and then we're looking to make 2 investments in the next 2 months. All of those companies are with founders that are kind of their average age is in their 30s, right? So I think that's really cool. And I think what's interesting is that because of our markets being somewhat similar and the barriers being similar, we're seeing really similar startups come up. And I always think when I was in Bangladesh and I met Adnan Pai, who runs Shiba, I was like, man, exactly what he's doing with these verticals. I'm like, I just wish our companies could all just merge together, because that's ultimately what needs to happen here. It's so cool. And so I think we've kind of been touching on this a little bit, and I'm being mindful of time. So we're going to answer this one question, and we have 5 questions that are live in the Q&A. If you continue to have, yes, I'm seeing a lot of questions that are coming in. If you have other questions, feel free to put it in the Q&A box. We'll try to get to it in the next 10 minutes. But the question that I have for you guys, because Enosh, you kind of brought this up, and we've kind of been alluding to the elephant in the room, which is the fact that we're all in the middle of a pandemic right now. It's obviously impacting our startup ecosystem. So I wanted to first ask you guys, how is COVID-19, the coronavirus pandemic, how is it impacting your ecosystems? And then how do we as ecosystem enablers, what are the best things that we can be doing right now to support startups? So let's go, maybe Sajani first, Enosh, and then Ejaj. Go ahead.
I think at least from our members, what we've seen is some are positive about it and some are not. So it's like really a 50-50 where they're coming out, it's like, even after this curfew is over, we don't know what's going to happen. And with that uncertainty, or the others are like, oh, this curfew is going to happen and we're going to come out of it just fine. So it's 2 very different aspects. And I feel like, I've only had a company in Sri Lanka for like 2 years. And in that 2 years, I've gone through having 2 prime ministers, one Easter Sunday bomb attack, and now COVID. I'm like, guys, I just need a break. And all of these ones in being in a physical space, it's tough, right? You're like, whenever you're going through this, you just don't know what is going to happen on the other side. But it's just been nonstop. One thing that I am seeing though, one thing that was really highlighted in this is, everyone on this call right now, from the participants to everyone, we are a very privileged, audience. right? And we, no matter where you come from, if you have internet connection, if you have the way to order something online, that is so much privilege that, and all of startups are also catering to that privilege, which is one thing that has come out of this, where I'm like, we have to do something to the people, for the people that doesn't have access to this. Because I know for a fact, like, there were people that couldn't, because everything was online ordering, like, you know, they couldn't get food to their house delivered on time, because even when they called the supermarkets, they were prioritizing the orders that were going out on these delivery platforms. And it had taken 6 days and they couldn't get the food, and I just ordered it all the way from here on a platform.
Wow.
And got that delivered in 40 minutes. I'm like, this system is so broken.
Yeah.
And, you know, how is it that I can order it from San Francisco and they can't just, you know, those orders are not being fulfilled? So I think what's going to come out of this is that definitely that logistics, fulfillment, supply chain side of e-commerce, and how do we get more accessible technology and money like fintech and things like that into the hands of a wider audience. And I think that's going to take a much, these are not short-term things, these are very long-term games, like what Ejaj is playing. It's a long-term game. And I think that's going to be some eye-opener. Like, I hope everyone is paying attention to that fact, that that is a need that is going to, one, actually help the ecosystem, because your audience is going to be bigger who's able to access technology. But those are some underlying things that I'm seeing. I saw, like, Enosh and I were talking, and he's like, oh yeah, we have mobile ATMs now. I'm like, wow, that's amazing. And he's like, well, we are putting an ATM on a truck and taking it.
Oh no.
That's awesome. You know, that is also very innovative.
It
like,
is. I think, yeah.
Yeah, because we were running out of cash. I'm like, okay, that's another one way to do it.
That's kind of amazing, and something I've never actually seen before. Yeah.
I think the immediate reaction and immediate what we as an ecosystem went through was like, you know, immediate shock and then disorientation. That's what immediately followed. And right now, even when we talk to so many startup founders, it's just that disorientation, like, you know, they're like, you know, rotated and they don't know which direction they're facing right now. And it's not even helping when we are on lockdown. We don't even know like when there's going to be lifted. It's just on indefinite lockdown, like forever. So that's kind of, you know, again, disorienting the entire ecosystem. And one of the things is, I think maybe compared to more of the Western countries or more mature startup ecosystems, maybe startups here don't do very hardcore risk planning, or, you know, their financials is not very hardcore. They don't give too much of importance. So right now, one of the biggest problems is cash flow and runway for most of the startups. And even I think few startups are even now getting to know, okay, what exactly is a runway of, you know, how long can you sustain your operation? That is one of the looming problems or concerns for most of our startups here. But I think as a positive, what has happened is, again, going back to the ride-hailing app, PickMe, they partnered with the local, let's call it the local supermarket chain called Satosa. It's just amazing. I mean, again, a partnership we would never have imagined in our wildest dreams, but, you know, that happened. That's the very first partnership that happened to get groceries to homes. Then maybe some interesting, there's one particular startup which was heavily focused on low budget beds. It was more like Airbnb low budget beds. It was almost like the ride-hailing app format. They pivoted into delivering groceries, and the startup goes as Yoho Bed, and they came up with a new brand called Yoho Mart, which is like amazing. So I think there is a lot of opportunities arising out of maybe a crisis like this. We once saw one of my good friends who runs a e-commerce platform called Takas. They were purely into like, the tech products and no sight of vegetables there. But, after this happened, they quickly made partnerships with vegetable grocery providers, and they went ahead with that as well. So I think there's some good things also happening, which we wouldn't have seen in our day-to-day operation, because it was, to a certain extent, I think it was too monotonous.
Yeah, totally agree. Ejaj, what about Bangladesh? You're on mute again.
So I'll sort of preface this by talking about the whole economic condition of Bangladesh, and then focusing on the startups. I think the economic impact of COVID-19 is also going to be somewhat similar across our countries, because there are so many similarities in our countries. So Bangladesh, around 80% of our export earnings comes from one sector, which is the ready-made garment sector. Within 3 weeks of March, more than $3 billion worth of garments orders were either cancelled or held up. So that's like a big shock to the RMG sector. And then in March, many of our migrant workers, who are a major sort of foreign currency earner for Bangladesh, started coming back. As you know, the global prices of oil has gone down. So UAE, Saudi Arabia, two of the major destinations for Bangladeshi migrant workers, are not hiring. Their economy has suffered. Italy was another destination. So a lot of migrant workers are coming back. And the reason I say this, when migrant workers are coming back, the village economy is dependent on the earnings of migrant workers. So look what's happening in the village economy. Look what's happening at the state level. The government has given a large enough bailout package to the tune of around $9 billion. More than 50% of that is in loan. So it's not just a stimulus package where it's a grant base. It's a loan. They're subsidizing the interest. Commercial banks will be giving that loan to the large corporations. So there's a big challenge in the private sector. What does it mean for startups? I think startups will be hit from at least 3 areas. First, because of this global depression, and I call this a depression because it will be a prolonged period of recessions for multiple quarters, not just 1, 2, which is a textbook definition of a recession. So in this global depression, funding is going to come down. Many LPs who have committed to VCs, when I talk to a lot of the VCs, the LPs are thinking twice, because these LPs are losing money in real estate, they're losing money in the stock market, they want to play it safe. So startups will have a hard time in raising money. Startups will have to remember that it's not a founder's market, it's an investor's market, which means that your valuation is going to go down.
Yep.
You have to negotiate really hard. That's one challenge. The other lesson for Bangladeshi startups is when this RMG orders started getting cancelled, most of these factory owners started seeking to the prime minister that give us wages for our workers. They were struggling to pay 1-2 months of salaries. But imagine an entrepreneur who's been running a business for 10 years, you're making profit for 10 years, don't have the cash to pay your workers' salary for 2 months. It's a lot of money, but it's also a large company, So for startups, managing your finance, managing your cash is absolutely critical. And if you did not, in a pre-coronavirus situation, manage your runway well, you will really, really struggle. And the recommendation, not from me, like all the top VCs around the world from Silicon Valley are saying that you need to plan for at least 6 to 12 months. You need to have that cash. If you previously had a runway for 6 months, make it for 12 months. Cut down your marketing expenses, all other expenses. So manage your finance well. Fundraising is going to be really, really hard. Some of the startups we are, in our cohort in Bangladesh, for example, a renewable plastic company, their raw materials came from China. So you're hit on the supply side. The supply chain is disrupted. That's one problem. On the demand side, in a depression, people don't care about luxuries. They care about rice, lentil, basic necessities.
Right.
Now, if Europe is shut down till June, July, and our part of the world, we are in lockdown till May, June, Eid is coming up, many of the festivals are coming up. Do you think people will be in a mood to buy luxuries for the rest of the year? People will not. So startups will have to really think hard. You need to solve a major problem for your customer. You have to fall in love with the customer and solve not a minor problem, a major problem that the customer is facing. So they need to really zoom in on the customer's problem, think really hard about fundraising, which is going to be difficult. Think a lot about the supply side. But as Enosh said, there will be new opportunities. Where will these opportunities be? A lot of the logistic companies, a lot of these online deliveries. There will also be a lot of opportunities in supply chain. Why? Because people are learning the perils of globalization. Now, countries will not want to depend on other countries for everything, for all of your raw materials. So there may be a lot of opportunities on the supply chain side of things in our part of the world.
Yeah, there's been a Zoom facilitation thing where you snap when you agree 100%. So totally snapping to that. I actually think that's really good advice for ecosystems everywhere for people. And we've been getting we have 14 questions, guys, but I would say that, and we can't obviously get to all of this, but I think a lot of the questions were questions around how do we raise funding during this crisis? What do we do in this pandemic? And I think, to what everyone said, but especially Ejaj, what you were saying about fundraising, that's really important right now, right? Is that in Pakistan, for an example, everything obviously has been paused, except for people that are in essential services, people that are going to do well, or people that are in health tech, especially telehealth right now. And one of our past companies, Sehat Kahani, is doing really well in this environment. And then ed tech is something that's going to do well in terms of distance learning, because no one is going to school. They're all sitting and learning online, right? So also what I would say is what I'm noticing, which is really interesting, is the pivot that's happening in certain companies, similar to, what you guys were talking about in Sri Lanka and Bangladesh as well. One of a company that I know really well, and actually we did a panel together last week, a company called Co-Natural, which is a natural beauty company in Pakistan. Myra is one of the most kick-ass founders you'll ever meet in the ecosystem. They obviously do high-end luxury products, right? For beauty, all, chemical, sulfate-free. What they ended up pivoting during COVID was that they ended up starting, because Pakistan, as is everywhere, doesn't have hand sanitizers on the market anymore. They're all gone. So Co-Natural started to produce hand sanitizers. They sold over 40,000 in just 2 weeks. They focused all their manufacturing on that. And what's really interesting is that, first of all, not only is their sanitizer something that's been really popular, it actually got certified by the Punjab government for being the best sanitizer on the market right now. So to me, that's a really great example to what, Ejaj, you were talking about, is how do you actually pivot your model? Because high-end luxury, people will still want to buy beauty products after this is over. And I say this as a woman, I'm like dying to get my eyebrows threaded right now. I was like, ugh, like missing my beauty stuff. But we have to realize the macro impact on people's spending power, right? So what do we do to actually make, beauty products that were maybe a little bit very high end, a little bit more mainstream? How do we maybe realize that consumers might still want sanitizers? They may want cleaning products. One of our companies is an on-demand for household help. How do we actually, disinfectant services right before they had to pause operations became huge, so people wanted their houses disinfected. How do we leverage that in the post-COVID world, right? For companies that are doing delivery of essential services, so medicines, like all of that, how do you change maybe just doing regular e-commerce to really thinking about this world? Because we will pause operations, we will probably reopen, and the reality is we may have to pause again, right? So you have to there needs to be a scenario planning that happens for you as a startup, where you're thinking about the worst and best case scenario, and probably plan for the worst, right? Knowing that you will be impacted by having to pause over again. So realizing what are the things that are not being paused, what are the things that are doing really, really well right now. And then also realizing that in this time, there is a huge opportunity where people are becoming more and more comfortable with shopping online, and being able to learn online too, right? So one of our past ed tech companies, EdCasa, as well as Dot and Line, which were both part of our accelerator program, are doing really well in this space of realizing, wow, we're actually getting so many more people's attention, where sometimes it was hard of the leverage of technology, people getting used to that. We're actually going to leverage this as an opportunity right now, right? And so I think for me, that's what's really important. And to Ejaj's last point about valuations, because there's a couple questions here, and if you guys want to weigh in on this as well, Enosh and Sajani, a couple questions that have come in have been about fundraising in this. Personally, number one, as an investor, we're not looking at any new deals right now beyond what was already active in our pipeline. So be aware that a lot of investors are going to take a little bit of a back seat because it is a bearish market right now. So we have to really look at deals from the angle of like who's going to do the best in this scenario planning. And then also that we have to keep reserves in place for our current portfolio because some of our companies are really suffering right now. So one thing that I would keep in mind is that your valuation will take a hit if you decide to fundraise right now. So if you can bootstrap right now. Don't raise money if you don't have to. If you really have to, go with the knowledge that your valuation will take a hit unless you are in the essential services. So food delivery or grocery delivery, like Enosh was talking about, is going to do really well right now. So pivot your model if it means that, right? Telehealth is going to do really well right now. EdTech is going to do well. And those valuations actually might either get better or do exactly the same. So I would just keep that in mind and just wanted to see if you guys wanted to weigh in on that question too, because this is me leading into the many questions that we have and trying to get to as many as we can in the next 20 minutes. So go ahead, guys, if you have anything to add.
I think from a perspective here, I think it's no investment, there is no deals happening at the moment. There is no talks happening at the moment because I think every pandemic is unique, and even the repercussions of the crisis is only educated guesswork. It's more than science. So right now, because there's so much of uncertainty, right now there's like no investment happening, at least I don't see. But even if anybody wants to raise, I think the investor will have the bigger bargaining power at the moment.
Yeah. And like Ejaj said, it's the same thing in Sri Lanka where, I mean, a lot of the private funding or like anyone who has money who will invest in companies are either one or two, like they're either government, they're in the government, they're in the IT, they're in travel, like they're in those huge tea export and like all of these, you know, like industrial almost money, like traditional ways of, you know, like it's not new. It's not like a huge startup person. We haven't reached that stage in our you know, life cycles yet in Sri Lanka, right? So all of those businesses are going to be hurting. And it's the same way as in Bangladesh. We have so much immigrant workers. They're our highest foreign currency earners, and that is going, and even that is going to happen at more, not as an investment side, but you know, more like you were saying, like the normal day-to-day people's lives are going to be affected that way. And then one thing I would say is like if you can find those right partners and the right investors who are going to be betting on the facts, on the things that have opened up yet right now, in, for an example, making the addressable market bigger in ways of reaching a bigger audience, right? I think those are going to be the ones that's going to be interesting and actually can weather a storm like this, because I mean, we're seeing that in startups here too, right? Like all these direct-to-consumer companies in the US are laying 50% of their staff off and everyone, and it's just like cash management has not even been a thing, I guess, even here, because I'm thinking, how did you raise so much money and you don't have the money to, you know, stay afloat for 2 weeks? Like that's, I think so. Those education parts, maybe it's a really good time for the entire cohort to come together, entire region to come together and really put in some of those basic education during this time. And then also maybe work on things that are going to increase the addressable market.
Yeah. And really think about being as lean as possible, because I think that's the problem, is that we behaved in a world where we thought money was abundant and we were like, let's just get a lot of cash. And we're like, okay, what happens when we strip all of that away? How do you become the most lean version of what you can do? Ejaj, do you have anything to add? You're on mute again.
I think, no, great insights. We can take some of the other questions. I think a lot of people are asking about.
Those are a lot of the questions about the pandemic. But go ahead, Ejaj.
Pandemic, yeah. No, I think a lot of people are trying to understand what are the big opportunities coming out in this, you know, in this pandemic situation. There will be a lot of opportunities. But I agree with Kulsum that it's best to bootstrap at this stage and not, you know, take institutional support because your valuation is going to take a hit. And it's also going to be very difficult. Everyone's watching how things evolve for the next couple of months, right? And we don't know when the vaccine is going to come out. Some experts, Bill Gates is spending billions of dollars on funding multiple factories.
Yeah.
And if it takes till next April, then this lockdown could continue for many more months. So that's something that we have to figure out. I would encourage everyone to keep that in consideration when we are planning of launching our startup. That's one thing, right? And even from an investor's perspective, if I had $10 to invest, right now I would spend that $10 in buying food for people who need it. There's so many people in our countries because the informal sector is big in South Asia. The informal sector is big, and all these people have become unemployed overnight, and they're struggling to find food. So I think the urgency right now, of course, we have to talk about startups, think about startups, but the urgency right now is to get food delivered to people who need it the most. I think many investors will be thinking along those lines. Anyone who has extra money is going to put it on getting food, getting support for people who need it. I think that's the bigger call. And that is also something that startups will be competing with. Am I going to invest $10 in an exciting startup, or is my money better spent in just providing this emergency service to people who need it? That's how I think many of the people I'm talking to in Bangladesh, in the private sector, large corporations, that's how they're thinking.
Yeah.
And that is going to affect startups. So I think right now, staying alive is the most important thing. Many of us may have to defer our dreams, by 6 months to a year. That's okay. It's not the best case scenario, but part of life is absorbing loss and accepting it. Staying healthy, staying safe, those things are a lot more important. So I would encourage, everyone in the audience, those who want to be entrepreneurs or who are launching their startups, thinking of launching their startups, to keep these things in mind, focus on their safety, hunker down, survive, endure this for the next one year, and then a brighter tomorrow is going to come, and then all your dreams can be materialized then.
Yeah, I have two quick things to add as well. Is number one, so for people that are, just to what Ejaj was talking about with the renewable plastics, I was just talking about a natural beauty company. Exports are going to be, and supply chain are going to be massively hit right now. So think about import substitutions as well. If you happen to run a product company that depends on the import of raw materials, import substitutions and being able to be nimble and thinking about how to shift your product in a way that allows you to leverage what's already around you, I think is really smart. It's something that Myra at CoNatural is doing right now anyway. And I think that is the smart thing to do. But I also think the second thing that I would really advise people is that everyone is in this kind of immediate state of crisis, which is totally normal, because I think, I was just stressed out yesterday being like, did I disinfect my doorknob when I walked in the door? Like, let alone thinking about, who am I investing in, right? That's, as an investor, that's what I'm stressed out about, is like, did I just accidentally infect someone because I exposed myself, right? So we have to think about it from a Maslow's pyramid perspective of like, what are people needing? Like food, all of that stuff, our health, safety, all of those things are really important. But I also would say that to be really mindful of when you are rethinking your business, there is a difference in being a short-term reaction to something versus thinking about it in the medium and long term, right? So you can create like a reactionary measure for your company to say that we are going to only create sanitizers, as an example, over the next 6 months, right? But our medium term strategy is like, what are we looking to in terms of how consumers might behave? And this is all an assumption post the COVID world, right? We believe, our assumption or our hypothesis is that we think that people will not want to spend, their consumer buying power is going to go down, right? That people will still be focused on wanting to keep things clean. That people will, these are assumptions that we're going to make, but that'll also help you in your scenario planning for the medium term, and also ensure that you're also not constantly thinking about your business strategy as purely reactionary, because you have to think about things a little bit more medium term. And as an investor, that's something that I want to know, is that you're thinking of things beyond the next few months. And I think that's important I don't know if you guys have anything to add to that, and then we'll move on to another question, because we have 10 minutes left and like 50 questions, so many. Go on. Anything to add? Otherwise, let's answer another question. And then the way I'm going to, because a lot of the questions did come in about the pandemic. But what I do think is we answered a lot of that. But I think that, Yeah. Okay. So I think what we're gonna do is I'm gonna boil a question into the way that we end all of this. So before we do that, let me just ask a question around we answered about sectors that boomed. There is a good question that came in about Sri Lanka, and we can probably zoom it out for everything else. Okay. Do we want to answer the question about the Sri Lanka risk building resilience in context of Corona and in case of Sri Lanka in the aftermath of Easter bombings last year? How are startups formally building resilience in terms of risk management and business continuity? We kind of answered that, but if we have any advice or things that we've seen, and maybe we can answer that for the regional perspective.
Sorry, I didn't see the question again. Is it in the Q&A box?
It's in the Q&A box, yes.
Okay. And I think in context of Corona, in the case of Sri Lanka and the aftermath of the disaster, how are startups building resilience in terms of recognized from our background when corporate do this compliance? I think it's going to so one is time, right? And in one case where Sri Lanka after Easter attacks completely stopped everything for like maybe one month, and then it was slow to get back. And I think again, but this situation is completely different. Even though it has kind of the same ways of stopping the businesses, I think this one is going to be a much longer term situation. Even though the attacks happened, the tourism sector kind of didn't fully come back, but it was doing okay until this happened again. And I think we just have to go and see it and see how this works. But in terms, I think the whole common thread, what has opened the conversation up in terms of building more resilience is that we have to diversify also into those terms of making that addressable market who has access to technology and who is yearning for these things much bigger. And it's come out of this that like we were saying, like people are more in tune to order online things and look at online things and edtech and actually tune into virtual meetings much more open now. So I think those ways, like I've seen workout places in Sri Lanka monetize that like within 1 week. They first came out, they did free workouts, and then they figured out how to do a workout webcast, like online with paid access. And I think it's those kinds of things that's going to help us get through it.
Any other advice on that? Because otherwise we can answer 2 more questions. Okay, let's move on in terms of answering another question, which actually was in the chat box and not in the Q&A, but I thought it was really good. Are there examples of regional collaborations and partnerships that are happening already? And if not, what are things that we could be doing right now? Ejaj.
I think there's a lot of opportunity because there are so many similarities, in our region, in our countries and cultures. There's a lot more opportunity. A good starting point is having these conversations. When more people come together, spend time together, you have synergies, collaboration, and then the knowledge sharing is also very useful. I think it's just a matter of time before you start seeing a lot more joint efforts. Mm-hmm. A good first step is a webinar like this, where you're bringing people together. I think convening people together, like-minded people, is a good first step. And I'm quite optimistic about more collaboration in the future. There is no reason why South Asia cannot have more regional integration among its entrepreneurs.
Any thoughts from you guys, Sajani and Enosh?
I think it's going to be important, especially for Sri Lankan startups, that we always go outside of.
Yeah, because it's a relatively small market, right?
Market, right? We have 20 million people, and out of that, 15%, like what Enosh was saying, is a more addressable market. I think for Sri Lankan ecosystem, it is going to be super important that we tap into the rest of South Asia or the rest of Southeast Asia, right? And I do see, I think if I'm not mistaken, I see some initiatives and collaborations happening already. I just don't know the specifics yet, but I think even having, like you guys were saying, conversations and more like conversations based on how do we really either share knowledge or expertise in terms of what in the ecosystem have gone through and what worked, because we every year it seems like all of our countries are going to go through something and we come out of it some way or the other. So I think that's a one big common thread that we can all gel on and be like, okay, what are the things that, like a knowledge bank, almost like what did we do in this case and how did we come out?
Yeah.
I think making connection is, I think, the initial step, and I think even what we are doing right now is just amazing, because this is the starting point for any type of collaboration to initiate. And I think more.
Oops, your mic. I think you're covering your mic.
Sorry. Okay.
There you go. Yeah.
So more of, I think our generation would take this forward even more aggressively, because we are in tune with technology. We are having these conversations online, and I think that's going to make a lot of connections. I was also traveling to Cambodia a few times late last year and early this year as well. There were so many new initiatives that were just in place for me to go and sign the papers in March, and then Corona happened.
Corona happened. I think that's like hashtag Corona happens.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Enosh.
Just to finish, I mean, one of the interesting things that I saw was, like, I met people from Malaysia, I met people from Cambodia, Myanmar. There is so much of interest and openness to collaborate.
Yeah.
It's just that when we don't travel, we don't get to see this. It's like, when we don't travel, we see that, we think that the rest of the world is all the same, that they just want to stay in their own cocoons. But when we actually go out and talk to people, there are a lot of new initiatives. I myself, I was able to connect a few startups from Cambodia to back in Sri Lanka, and there were some initiations going on, which I found like really amazing, because all it took was just making the connection on email.
Yeah,
it's
seriously.
So I'm very optimistic that collaborations is only a connection away, and we need to take the initiative to do that.
Yeah, agreed with that. Sajani, you were going to say something else?
I was just going to say within the region, funding perspective, I think is also something that one, it's going to be hard just because of how hard it is to move money around within the region. I mean, even that, so that's a big thing. But I think it's going to be important if we are talking about startups that are going to go out of your own country and actually expand and things, that funding aspect and that government collaboration when it comes to that is, I know, like
huge.
It's huge.
Yeah.
That's going to be a huge hurdle. And the only way that can happen is if the more private partnerships start happening and you urge the government to, bring it up as a need in order to do it. Because now we know the governments can clearly react fast given that this situation. So we just need to happen.
I think that's an illustration of political will, right? So if there's a will to do it, obviously there's a way, but I think I agree with that, because I think I was in Nepal 2 years ago, and I've done work with a few organizations in Nepal as well. And when I was there, they were like, it's similar. Nepal and Sri Lanka are similar in terms of being like just smaller economies that do need to, startups have to expand out of their market, versus in Bangladesh and Pakistan, it's a huge market in itself. And so what I think was interesting was when I met these guys in Nepal, like doing this really amazing ed tech company. And they were like, we're dying to do it in Pakistan, but it costs so much to travel to Pakistan. They're like, it's just easier to we can go to Bangladesh, we can go to Sri Lanka, but it's so hard to go to Pakistan. And I think that's what's the tricky part, right? Is sometimes the way that our geostrategic, our political issues means that oftentimes logistically it's hard. So even in this period, the fact that we can leverage technology in this way, I think I remember when the BYLC thing was going on, when the BYLC, when our partnership with BYLC is happening, we couldn't get, I mean, I can go to Bangladesh, but my team couldn't go to Bangladesh. So we ended up starting to do our engagement online anyway. And it's turning out pretty, I mean, it's not ideal, but it's pretty great in terms of what we've been able to do just with technology. So I think there's a lot of opportunity for that. We are at time. So before we end, let's take 1 minute. Everyone take maybe no more than like 15 seconds each to not only just, obviously quick, like one word about how you're feeling right now about the future, but then also because so many questions came in about people launching companies and tips that they would give, say maybe one thing you would give as a piece of advice to a young entrepreneur that's starting out right now. So let's go Ejaj, Enosh, Sajani, and then I'll end. Ejaj, go first.
So from a business perspective, I think launching a company just after a crash is a great time if you can time it well. But during a crash, it may not be the wisest thing to do. So I think if we can get to the deep end of the recession and then you launch a company, I think there are a lot of opportunities. And I'm not talking from making my own assumptions. If you look at historically, many of the great companies were born just after the recession in the last 50 years, if you look at that trajectory. So that's one. The second, I think we are going through this this profound moment of crisis that none of us has experienced. Even our parents have not experienced this in their lifetimes. It's a very unprecedented time. And I think a crisis like this is the best opportunity to bring out the best side of humanity. And right now, of course, startups matter, but I think each one of us has to project, bring out the best side of ourselves and help people. I think Sajani said, in the beginning that we're all privileged because we have got this, internet connectivity to come online and have a chat. A lot of people will need our help. So I think that's that helping attitude that we need to first overcome the crisis. And then once things tone down, a lot of business opportunities, if you can plan well, I think a lot of opportunities will be there in food, in logistics, in many of the sectors. I think many participants ask questions about food, agriculture, health tech. All of these sectors are somewhat essential. So there will always be opportunities in these sectors. It's just a matter of navigating the current complexities and make sure that you're alive. If you don't survive, there is no startup. So you have to survive,
Exactly.
Stay at home.
Stay at home. Yeah. Stay healthy.
And stay healthy and let's just help out whoever is in our network, those who need, look after them, and we will together overcome this. So thank you.
Thank you. Enosh?
For me, I would say this is just purely interesting times that we are going through, and we just need to embrace it because it's nothing to be negative about, because all of us as a world we are going through. So this is something for us to embrace. And I would say this is the time that we actually have an opportunity to do something like completely weird and crazy, and because we have that opportunity, go make something wonderful. The entire world has been, going on a, mindless rat race. And I think this is kind of like a good speed bump for us to kind of stop in our tracks and then realize what we are doing, where we are going. And I think this calamity can create a new types of consumers. It can create new types of demand and supply. And this is almost like a recalibration of the entire world. And if we can look at it in that aspect, I think post-COVID, it's going to be a new world where we need to completely rethink of what we are doing in terms of products and services, and how do we go out to the market, and what is the new type of consumers that we are serving to. So definitely on an optimistic perspective.
Awesome.
Yeah. I'm hopeful for what's happening. And what's going to be on the other side of it. I think a lot of people are going to come from a different perspective, and the environment is healing. Hopefully we give a bigger attention to that as well. The world is healing, and I think for anyone who's starting a business, I think at any age, one, just don't start it just to start a business. I think just make sure, and this is like just the fundamental of anything, is like there is a huge problem that people are always thinking about, like there's no good solution that you're solving for. I think that has to be just like the number one thing. And just like when you're talking to users, to end users, to just like make sure that it's a painful problem to them, because no matter what happens in the world, then you will build something that that will, you know, stay the course.
Awesome. Yeah, agreed with all of that. I am generally, my current emotion is feeling very grateful right now. Super grateful to these amazing panelists for joining today. And just kind of grateful about, yeah, the privilege that I have personally to be safe and healthy and to have the ability to do something like this, because I recognize that so many friends are taking pay cuts, have lost their jobs, are people that are losing their jobs. So I feel, for me, grateful for that, but also, you know, wanting to be as active and supportive as I can for the future, not just for startups in my own ecosystem, but obviously putting the offer out to people in yours as well, if I can be helpful in any way. My one piece of advice that I would give, everyone gave really great advice. I would also say that make sure that the problem that you're solving, and to Ejaj's point, is an urgent problem right now, right? Like, what's the urgency behind what you're doing, and how is what you are building something that is brand new in some way? It doesn't have to be brand new as in no one's ever done it before, but it means that there needs to be a value proposition there that is different compared to what else is out there. So I would really do that research, and do your research and listen to what people are saying, because I think that's the biggest thing, is that we tend to sit in our rooms and believe that what we've been building is the best thing ever. But unless you're talking to your customers, it doesn't matter, right? So on that note, thank you to everybody that joined us. We had over 80 people at one point, and the fact that we're over time and we still have we have about 50 people here is amazing. We will be putting this recording up. Feel free to follow our respective organizations, Colombo Cooperative, as well as Sajani's new company that she just launched this past week, Cola.
Yeah. Cola Goodies.
Yeah.
Cola Goodies. Gotta give a shout out to that. Enosh is at Founders Institute, BYLC, Ejaj, and then Invest2, the number Innovate, Invest to Innovate. Feel free to follow us. We'll be posting more stuff and hopefully continuing these conversations for the future. Thank you guys, and stay safe.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Bye.
everyone.
Bye.
Okay, bye.
Thank you. See you. Bye.
Bye.